Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to share with you a very important comparison Australian market with UK market. Because we live in Australia and we always see that the comparison comes into what is happening in UK and how the commercial property actually in terms of the lease or other factors, how it gets compared. So it's good to know. So if you are interested, then let's watch till the end. In Australia, first of all, the lease structure is generally long term, which is quite common, right? In Australia, you can get a 3 years lease, 5 years lease, 10 years lease, and sometimes 15 years lease. And generally, these leases are what I call a landlord friendly lease. It's the landlord who would dictate that lease, and this is quite common in Australia. Versus the lease terms in UK is different. The lease term in UK is always a shorter lease, is generally 3 to 5 years lease, and it's not very landlord friendly. It is more of a tenant friendly because there are some certain rules and regulations that has been put by the government and you have to abide by these things. So in UK it is quite common that it's a shorter lease, and in that shorter lease, which is like 3 years lease or so, where you'll be seeing that it's more of a tenant rights than the landlords. And sometimes these leases in UK, there would be a break clause. So basically tenant can break those, leases, even though they're signing a 3 years lease, they are unable to, perform these, they can break the lease, which is in Australia is not possible. If generally speaking, if you sign a 5 years lease, then there is no way you can break the lease. There could be some legal consequence, and particularly you have to pay, unless you just call yourself bankrupt, your lease is quite well protected in Australia, whereas in UK it is not. It is, you can break, there are some break clauses, and that can be applied if the tenant wants to move out. Another difference is that in Australia it is quite common to have a CPI or a fixed rent increase, right? You can get a 3% increase, and sometimes the CPI increase. So if the CPI, consumer pricing index, that goes up to, let's say, 5%, then that particular year the rent is going to go up to 5%. Whereas in UK it is quite common to see there is a no rent increase for the next 3 years. So it's a fixed, sometimes 1%, 2% increase, but generally, if you sign a 3 years lease, the rent can stay the same for the next 3 years. And that could be a bit of challenge from as a landlord point of view, because your rent is not going up even though there is an inflation, even though the CPI increase, or even though the CPI is there, let's say 2% or 3%. So in a nutshell, longer lease in Australia giving you more security and it's more landlord friendly, whereas the shorter lease in UK is giving you kind of a not so well stability, right? From a landlord point of view, you don't know that when the tenant is going to move out, and as a result that you need to look for another tenant. So I would be focusing more on stability rather than not so stable, which is like a short term fluctuations in UK. In Australia, what you can see is what we call the triple net lease, where the tenant is responsible for all these maintenance rates and everything that will be paid, right? It will be paid by tenant on top of the rent. Whereas in UK it's not quite common. There's something called FRI, it's called full repairing and insuring of that lease, but then tenant does the repairing, but there is varies, right? There is not all the things that you can pass it on to the tenant. So in Australia it's the net lease, is the triple net lease, but in UK it is not. So it's like a modified gross lease, kind of a modified gross in UK. But the more important part that you need to understand is that in Australia we have what we call a landlord friendly lease. So if tenant wants to move out and if they wants to break it, it is always going to be landlord's favor. The court is always going to be giving you in landlord's favor, whereas in UK it is more of a tenant's favor, because in the event if tenant wants to move out, then there is always a break lease clause, and in that break lease clause you are not going to lose a significant amount of money. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have signed a 5 years lease and your tenant after 2 years wants to move out. If it is in Australia, then potentially you can ask them for the next 3 years full of rent if you are not able to rent it out. That's how the net lease, and that's how probably it has been written in the lease. lease. Whereas the same example, if you take it to UK, then after 2 years, if the tenant wants to move out, yes, they might pay some break fee, but not like the whole of 3 years, the remaining 3 years of the rent, because there is a break clause always included in UK, and that's break clause can be like 3 months or something that they have to pay. So this is how that in Australian market the lease structure is quite strong, whereas in UK it is not that strong. It's more of a tenant friendly, and as a tenant you can start doing the business even though you're signing a 3 years lease, knowing that there is a chance that if you are unable to pay rent or unable to do the business, you can always move out and you would not be penalized significantly. So if I just compare both in terms of leasing structure, both Australia and UK, I would always see that Australian market is way better and way stable in terms of investing, and particularly if you're living in Australia, as compared to if you want to invest into UK and in the foreign market where it's not so good landlord friendly lease available. If you are enjoying this, then consider subscribe our channel, turn the notification bell on so you get to see more videos like this. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.